In this video, we're going to have a look at modulation within Playbox. Now, modulation allows you to use modulation sources to affect the effects parameters, allowing you to change the sound over time and introduce that kind of all-important movement to a sound. Now, the modulators are located down here, and we have LFOs, this mod step, some envelopes, and a humanize function. Now, before we jump into this, we need to know actually how to assign a modulation source to affect a parameter. I'm going to use the filter to demonstrate this because it's quite an obvious one to hear. So to assign a modulation source to affect a target parameter, what we need to do is click underneath the parameter in question. So in this case, let's use the cutoff, and let's use LFO A as an example, and click and drag up, and you can see this modulation assignment being added in here. Now, if we hear this sound play, we can hear that modulation taking place. Now, we've got this on a random waveform here. Let's listen to something a little bit more traditional. So we can hear that modulation taking place there. The modulation is now being added in, so the LFO is affecting the filter cutoff. Now, we could have another modulation source affecting this. So, for example, we could use macro A to affect the filter cutoff, and also have the LFO affecting the filter cutoff. Now, if we wanted to remove a modulation assignment, all we need to do is click on the name underneath and click none, and it's removed. Okay, so that's how we actually route modulation sources to affect targets. Let's have a look at the LFOs as our first modulation sources. Now, LFOs allow us to create periodic modulations, essentially. So traditionally, they've been used to create things like vibrato, tremolo, wah-wah effects. And traditionally, they operate below the human hearing range from 0 to around 20 hertz, because that means we can actually hear them as being kind of discrete modulations, because if they're too fast, then our ear can't actually separate them out as being movement. So for things like vibrato, they're quite useful because they're going to be operating around the speed that a guitarist would say bend a string. Well, first of all, I should say we have two LFOs here. And the first thing we can do is change the waveform shape. So we had a look at sine. We have triangle, square, sawtooth, random, and smooth random. So random is going to be like a kind of sample and hold. Let's add some resonance in. This is a bit more pronounced. And then smooth random is going to be what we had originally. So sample and hold, but with smooth transitions. The rest we're probably familiar with from subtractive synthesis. Then we have a speed setting here. And that's going to be the speed of the modulation. So this actually goes up to 15 hertz. So some LFOs go up into the audible range, but this one operates up to 15. Now, the LFO can be bipolar or unipolar. When it's bipolar, we're going to be moving either side of a central point, like so. We click on this B, and we make it unipolar. You'll see the difference here. Now it's only going from wherever the cutoff is set positively. That's because we have the amount set positively. We could also do that negatively as well. That's bipolar and unipolar. We can also sync this to the project tempo, like so. And that means we're no longer going to be working in hertz. We're going to be syncing to the project tempo. Now, in addition, we can choose to reset the phase of the LFO using this little button here. That's going to reset the phase on every no time message, and we can set where the phase is going to be using this little slider. So you'll notice a difference. You see this is always moving, and every time I press a note, it's just picking up the position of the LFO. Whereas if I switch this on here, we're always starting from the same point. So it's basically an LFO re-trigger. Now those settings are going to be the same for both of the LFOs, so they're completely identical, so we can use both of those to change parameters simultaneously. Those are the LFOs. Okay, so next up, let's have a look at the mod step. Now the mod step is a modulation sequencer that allows you to create kind of complex rhythms, and this can be like stepped sequences up to kind of more complex shapes. We have presets here we can choose from, so let's have a look at some of these. See that? So kind of stepped ones. So quite complex potentially. Let's take this routing off. And instead, let's add in a mod step to the filter cutoff. And let's add this in positively. So once again, we have the same controls here, unipolar and bipolar, speed control, and we can also sync this to the project tempo. Now, the presets here are really useful. So you can see we can go through and try these out. And they go from kind of fairly simple to much more complex. We can also actually draw in our own sequences using this line tool if we right click, like so. We can also right click and drag up and down to change individual steps of a sequence as well, which is quite useful. We can also click and hold, as we know, and drag across. So we can cut some sequences that way. Now, what we can also do is randomize here. So we can just click and come up with some kind of happy accidents. Now, two further parameters here is this button that allows us to alternate back and forth. So with this selected, we're going all the way to the end and all the way back again. An alternate pattern. Switch that off, we're just going to be going in one direction. And we can also restart on a note on message. So this is the same as the parameter was for the LFOs. Otherwise, the mod step is kind of freely running and every note on message is just going to pick it up at a different point of its cycle. Okay, so that's the mod step. Now, here we have an envelope. Well, we have two envelopes, an amplitude envelope, which is going to be hardwired to affect the volume, and a modulation envelope. Now, there's a few extra details to the mod envelope. First of all, again, we can make it unipolar or bipolar. We also, quite interestingly, have the ability to be able to change the parameters here of the envelope using beats and bars, essentially, which is quite useful. That is for attack, decay, and release. Sustain, remember, is always going to be a measurement of level. This can be done in hertz as well if we switch that off. We also have an attack curve parameter here, which if we click and drag on, you see we can create different shapes to the attack, which is quite useful as well. So let's just route the mod envelope to affect, again, the filter cutoff. So you can see that shape on the attack curve there. So starting slowly, then speeding up, or we could do the opposite. So they can be a little bit more musical than just having kind of linear transitions. And as I said, we could be bipolar or unipolar. So depending on what the sound calls for, really. Okay, so that's the mod envelope and the amp envelope. Next up, we have humanize. So humanize is going to bring life to key aspects of each of your musical notes by introducing kind of unpredictable changes. So it can add random variation to velocity, to the note start point, the stereo position, and also the timing. And we can set this independently using each one of these different sliders. Let's just remove this modulation here so we can hear this at work. So let's try some random velocity added in, and let's just increase the cutoff so that's not affecting the sound. Let's bring up the velocity so we can hear that at work. So now we have a random variation applied to velocity. Let's try it on the start point. Subtle differences there. Let's take both of those down. Let's try this on the pan. So we're getting slight variations to the pan position. And then we have the same for timing. So it's going to be adjusting the rhythmic timing slightly of each note. So we're just very subtly introducing a little bit of kind of looseness and variation to each note, which can help things sound a little bit more musical. And those are our modulators and modulation in a way we can assign modulators. So remember, we assign modulators by clicking underneath on the little plus here, and we can put them in directly here. And to remove an assignment, we just need to click on the icon for the modulator and then click none. The modulators we have are two LFOs, which I'm sure we're used to using from subtractive synthesis. The mod step, which is like a kind of sequencer we can use to add in movement to sounds. Two envelopes, amplitude, envelopes hardwired for the amplitude, and modulation is going to be our modulation envelope that we can assign to affect whatever we want. It's quite interesting. We can go unipolar or bipolar. We've got attack curves, and we can also set this envelope up to work with beats and bars. Then finally, we have humanize, which allows us to randomly introduce kind of differences in velocity, start point, pan, and timing for each note to introduce a little bit of kind of variation. And those are the modulators and modulation assignments. In the next video, we're going to have a look at the macros and the performance controls. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.